Hello and welcome to my culminating speech for philosophy. The topic that I have chose to talk about is slavery. Now I will briefly be talking about what is slavery and just some short history about it, just so we're all on the same page. I will also be talking about the main philosopher or philosophers who talked about slavery and their arguments, whether how they justified it or how they didn't support slavery. And I will also be talking about my interpretation and my reaction to what they said. And finally, I will then be relating slavery to the three main branches of philosophy, which I feel like it most best relates to. Now, slavery by its definition means the practice of owning multiple slaves. Now, what slaves are, they are the legal property of their owners, and they're just forced to do as they're told, as I'm sure that you all are aware of. Now, what's interesting is if slaves chose not to obey their owners, or they formed some type of rebellious groups, which they did, most definitely did, they would be punished, which they would be hanged, beaten, whipped, and some would even be burned. Now, the women who were also slaves, they were often raped just randomly or out of the blue, and it was just a very disgusting and just a time where things like this just went on. And as I'm saying it, it's just hurting me, but this is the past, and now we make we talk about it now, but it still hurts, which I think is good because it shows the whole magnitude of what slavery really did. Now, how slavery started was when 20 Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, which at the time happened to be the British colony. Now, during the 17th century, European settlers would also often use African slaves instead of their own indentured servants, as they were cheaper and many more available. Now, what are indentured servants? Just briefly, I'm just going to say what it is. Indentured servants are slaves that, you can't call them slaves because they are basically what they are. They're servants, but it's with their will. It's a contract that they're given. Now, slaves are not given any sort of contract, and they are being enslaved against their will. Now, that's the difference between the two. Now, as time went on, millions and millions of Africans were essentially robbed of their freedom during the 18th century. And basically, Africa was robbed of their most capable and healthy men and women, as they were just slaves in Jamestown, Virginia, where they would often work in the rice, tobacco, and indigo plantation. Now, even though in 1808 the U.S. Congress banned slavery, it would still commence illegally, and the population of slaves actually grew 3 times in just 50 years, which the new number would then be 4 million more slaves. Now, during this time, the owners aimed to keep their slaves fully reliant on them by actually prohibiting them from learning to read and write, and continuously monitoring where they go. Now, that's just so messed up, so messed up, because not only are they working like so hard for these masters against their will, they are also just being tracked and monitored of every movement they make, because which tells us as the readers, when we read these disturbing things of our history, that they weren't trusted, they were treated like, well, trash, and it's just so inhumane. Okay, so now without any further ado, I will be talking about the main philosophers and writers who discussed about slavery. Now, these include Aristotle, Plato, and John Locke. Now, do keep in mind that in this presentation, I will only be going over Aristotle's perspective, and the reason for that is because it's not clear for Plato and John Locke. For Plato, it's not clear if he actually wanted slaves or not. Now, in his book, the idea he claims, well, it's believed that he claims that the ideal society, in his mind, should indeed have slaves. Now, but after I did some research, spending a couple of hours browsing the internet, doing research on academic resources, I came across multiple websites where this was being debunked, so I didn't want to include anything that might not be right. Now, as opposed to John Locke, same thing, limited resources, and it's said that John Locke believed that he did not want slaves, but it's kind of contradicting since John Locke owned stock in a company that owned slaves. So I chose not to include him as well. But with all of that being said, I do believe Aristotle's argument is more than adequate for this presentation. I also chose to say what those, to talk about Plato and John Locke just briefly, because they are big names in, well, the philosophy world, and I want everyone to be known that they do have some opinion on this. Okay, so Aristotle's argument. Now, Aristotle believed that there were two types of humans. The first type were born to be slaves, and the other were born to be, well, not slaves. They were born to rule over said slaves. Now, he said that slavery was also beneficial not only to the master, but the slaves themselves. Now, he says this because, in his words, he claims that slavery is natural, quote unquote, natural, and that the person with superior reasoning and the ability to think more critically should be the ones who rules over the one who cannot think critically. So that would be the slave. He also states that naturally, if one person cannot think critically, then it is only natural for them to be ruled over by someone who can, and by someone who is also more mentally and physically stronger than them, so that they have some guidance, and if they receive that guidance, then it would be morally right and justified that they are owned by masters, because, well, like I said before, they're being guided and told what to do so that they don't have to, because they don't possess said ability to think critically. Now, my opinion with all this is that I absolutely 100% disagree with Aristotle's argument. and how he justifies slavery. Now, for me, it's extremely surprising to see one of the great philosophers, Aristotle. Aristotle, just supporting slavery, and it's just shocking to me. And I'm still in awe, like how, why, but I'll go over it now and just how it is. Now, I don't believe that human being and human life should be used as a tool, which is the way as Aristotle suggests it to be. Now, Aristotle just coming to the conclusion that someone who lacks the ability to think critically and clearly should 100% be the slave of someone who can is just mind-boggling to me, and it doesn't really make much sense because sure, they can't think critically, they need some guidance, okay, but that doesn't mean that you should be able to rule over them and telling them what to do. That is so inhumane and absolutely messed up, because what if the person has some sort of mental issue? There are thousands, I'm sure hundreds of mental issues, patients with mental issues, various different kinds. And if that is the reason that their judgment is being clouded, why should they be punished because of that? It's just not right. And also, it's just so pitiful. Now, what's interesting is that Aristotle has no real way of distinguishing between those who who should be on what side. How do you really know if someone can't use their brain properly, if they can't think properly? How do you distinguish that, right? There's no real method. What if somebody is just having an off day? Somebody's having a bad day, and somebody else comes to a conclusion that, oh, he can't think properly. What is he saying? And now that person is just gonna be slaves for the rest of their lives. It just doesn't make sense. How are you going to distinguish between the two in a reliable method, which I don't even think is right to begin with? I completely personally disagree with this methoding and reasoning. Now, maybe he is doing this to justify slavery. Well, he is, but to justify it in a way where it's beneficial to him, because we know that Greek at the time had many slaves as well. Now, this brings me to the three main branches of philosophy, which I feel like slavery relates to, those being metaphysics, ethics, and politics. Now, this relates to metaphysics for me because metaphysics in this scenario, for slavery, would ask if a human being is merely just an object to slavery. Now, I do think this allows us to think deeply about the value of human life and how each life is precious. Are we as humans just supposed to be captured, beaten, and robbed of our lives so that we can help our masters and their economy? Now, is that not wrong? Now, I think that is wrong, and this brings me on to how that relates to ethics, the second part. Now, my points in ethics and metaphysics will be pretty similar. Ethics asks how we should behave, and this is similar because, as I said, is it morally right to rob someone of their freedom by not even giving them an option and letting them decide on their own free will? Now, if that is the case, it is most definitely 100%, as I've said that so many times already, because I do believe this to be true, unethical and morally wrong to rob someone of their freedom, and now you control over them and the rest of their lives. And if you don't like them, well, you just beat them. You don't like beating them, you're tired of that, you just sell them. It's just so messed up. Now, finally, it also relates to social and political philosophy because it allows us as a society to think back on slavery and the effects that it had and the divide that it causes between, well, African Americans, so colored people, and white people. And it's just hurting to see the divide now in modern day society that causes. Now that's how it briefly relates to the political side of things. It can also relate to the political side if we look at it at a more government level. Maybe it can be said that the government wanted to support it, slavery at the time. Well, not government, but like the main leaders at the time, the rich folk, and how they want, because it's a business for them. Slavery was a business for them. They trade slaves, sell them. It's just absolutely disgusting. This is how it relates to on the political side of things. Thank you so much for listening to this speech, and I wish you a good day.